All right, we're beginning with chapter 1 of the Nimzo-Indian course. This is the 4 Queen C2 chapter.
Yeah, hello and welcome everyone. So this is the most classical of all the Nimzo-Indian lines, and it begins, of course, with the move d4. And we, as Nimzo-Indian players, are going to respond with knight f6. Now, the other very, very classical opening you'll see is the Queen's Gambit declined with d5. And the move knight f6 has exactly the same idea. We are trying to control the e4 square. And again, Matt, throughout this repertoire, and particularly in this chapter, you will see both sides fighting for control of the e4 square. And it starts on move 1 with knight f6. White will continue with c4. They cannot play e4, and so they play the next best move, taking control of more central squares with c4. That makes sense. Great central control. And now we play the move e6. This is the hallmark move for the Nimzo and Queen's Indian, highlighting we would like to rapidly develop our bishop to the b4 square. And that is an expectation, Matt, that White wants to continue with the very natural move knight c3, which will again support the e4 push. So knowing White wants to play knight c3 and e4, we are preparing to prevent that with the move bishop b4. And White is at a crossroads. So in course 1, the course you're watching right now, we're going to cover the Nimzo-Indian, which is commenced after the move knight c3. And in course 2, we'll look at all the options White has when they don't want to enter the Nimzo-Indian, which primarily with the move knight f3, but also other tries. And now we enter the Nimzo-Indian with the move bishop b4, immediately pinning this knight, putting pressure on this knight. But what we're really doing here is fighting for this e4 square. So right now we have one piece controlling e4, and after the move bishop b4, there is no piece for White controlling this square. In this chapter, we are looking at Queen c2, the classical variation, and there's quite a few ideas for White here. Firstly, White is establishing a little bit more control of the e4 square. White would also like to continue with a3, forcing us to give up the bishop pair, gaining the bishop pair, and then arguing White has great control of the center. And depending how White wants to proceed from here, you can get different flavors of position. But the reason we're starting with 4 Queen c2 is it really highlights all the different themes and motifs of the Nimzo-Indian.
Yeah, when I think of the Nimzo-Indian, this is sort of the classic line I think of. 4 Queen C2. I've played this a little bit from the white side and just very, very briefly from the black side. And one of the themes that I felt like is you always run into these doubled C pawns for white on C3 and C4. And this Queen C2 move, like you mentioned, we have this option as white has the option of taking back with the queen. So here we're going to recommend castling. And there's a lot of options here, I know, but I think this is due to its flexibility. And we know that white could play e4, but what are we going to do in that case? We have a bishop takes knight, maybe?
After 5e4, we actually have a very nice d6 line that I'll highlight. But I will start us with the move 5a3 rather, which is, I think, the critical test of the entire Nimzo-Indian. Because if White can play a3, grab the bishop pair, build a big center, then White's just better. And so it's really useful, I think, as Nimzo-Indian players to understand why White is not better after this continuation and why Black's actually fighting for an advantage immediately. So the move a3. Now, whenever forced in the Nimzo-Indian, we are just taking on c3. We cannot afford to lose time retreating our piece. We have to keep moving forward. There's a ongoing battle between White's advantage in space and Black's advantage in development. And so retreating would lose some time, so we don't develop. And here we're looking at Queen c3. We will briefly cover Bishop takes c3 as well, but Queen takes c3 is the critical move in the Nimzo-Indian. And if you look at the board now, White has done a very good job of developing their queen. We have a knight developed and we're castled. So that's really the compensation for the bishop pair. Here we are recommending the move b6. One thing that happened after queen takes c3 is white no longer has control of the e4 square. So white is not threatening to play e4 on the next move. If white could get the bishop pair and play e4 on one move, white would probably have an advantage. But because the queen has been decoyed away from the e4 square, we actually now have time to establish our bishop on the long diagonal, further reinforcing our control of e4. And we're now entering a structure we're going to see again and again and again throughout this course. It's the Queen's Indian setup, where we have the very, very powerful bishop on the long diagonal. Now, the main move here is bishop g5, continuing our theme of fighting for the e4 square. So right now, prior to bishop g5, we had control of e4. White now pins our knight, taking away control of e4. White would like to play e4 on the next move if we allow it. But we have a very natural developing move here. Matt, of course, bishop b7, establishing the bishop on the long diagonal. And so just in time, again, we're preventing e4.
And that makes it really easy to understand, James, like knowing that white just wants e4 move after move, and we're trying to prevent e4 where we can. So here we're going to look at two options for white. We're going to look at f3 and we'll look at e3, the more common being pawn to e3. So let's start with that. And here we're going to go with the move pawn to d6. And I can tell you from the white side, it's not fun facing these structures sometimes because you can
Mhm.
kind of feel like knight b to d7, and black just gets this solid setup. And a lot of times they put their pawns on dark squares to complement this beautiful bishop on the long diagonal. And as white, it can just be very frustrating.
Yeah, well, that's right. And if we're not in the middle game yet, we're still in the opening. But if you start thinking about middle game concepts, you start thinking about what are the imbalances and where are the weaknesses. Well, black has no weaknesses, and all the pieces will come to good squares. We've already traded one set of minor pieces, so one advantage, one imbalance in the position is white does have a little bit more space. We will look to break that down in the near future, but with one set of minor pieces, that advantage is already slightly alleviated, and we'll see very quickly it's quite common to trade another set of minor pieces, at which point white really has no claim for an advantage at all. So after e3, d6, uh, knight e2 is a critical try. Knight f3 is very common as well, but we'll cover that in a different move order later. Knight e2 to me would indicate someone knows a bit of theory here. And white's idea is actually to move the queen and then put the knight on its best possible square, been c3, to reinforce e4. So again, once you understand this element of the Nimzo-Indian, that both sides are fighting for e4 and black cannot allow e4 on good terms. If white achieves e4, we need to get some other concession from them, like the doubled pawns or the bishop pair, or other advantages we'll see in different chapters. As long as white doesn't get e4 on good terms, black's doing quite well. So here we are recommending knight bd7, just reinforcing our knight, letting our queen move away. We also have ideas of potentially pushing e5 in these structures, cancelling out the space advantage. Just, black's just developing its our last minor piece. White continues with their plan queen c2, which both fights for e4 and prepares knight c3, at which point e4 will be possible. And here we have our first thematic move, and that's c5, just putting pressure on the middle. One thing I will say is throughout this entire course, I'm recommending the c5 pawn break wherever possible. It's the most classical. And what we're trying to achieve, Matt, is that sort of Sicilian style imbalance where we'll trade a c pawn for a central pawn and then be able to activate our rooks down the c file. That's really, really nice for us strategically. And again, we're creating more dynamic imbalances in the structure that are good for black, compensating for that missing bishop pair, compensating for that slightly less space. But as a Nimzo player, you do have other options. You can play for d5, you can play for f5, and so the Nimzo is a really nice repertoire choice because while what I'm recommending to you now, I think is the most classical and most solid, if you want to spice it up, if you want to give yourself other options in the future, it's very easy to add these additional lines onto your existing knowledge. So the idea of c5 is we just want to take in the middle and trade a wing pawn for a central pawn. The queen is on the c file, and we're going to put a rook opposite the queen, developing another piece. Life's good. Very simple, very natural moves. Rook d1. There are many continuations here, but Rook d1 is the most popular continuation in the club database. And so now Queen e7. And the idea of Queen e7 is just to support this e5 push and neutralize white's space advantage in the middle. This is a great maneuver to remember. It does come up in other chapters. The queen really likes to go to e7 in these structures, and that's because c7 achieves the same thing, but we'd really like to put a rook on c7 lined up with the queen. It's not c7, c8, bearing down the c file. And at this point, black has actually completed all the development. We're starting to play actively in the middle. White's king is still not castled. White is still, there's still questions about how white will finish development. And it's not easy. White cannot bring this bishop out via a fianchetto because of our bishop on the long diagonal. So they're going to have to move this knight again, deal with the long diagonal pressure, and then move the bishop. So there are actually several moves from finishing castling. And so black has compensation in the form of piece activity and a lead in development versus white's position. Which is another key Nimzo-Indian theme. So the knight comes to its best square. That makes sense. We get our desirable central pawn trade. And it's very common for black to for white to recapture with the rook. It's well known in the Nimzo-Indian if white plays e takes, it's black that's playing for an advantage, not for white. Just because of what we mentioned, black would have the extra central pawn, black would have pressure down the c file, white would not have any pressure down the e file because the e6 pawn is defended by another pawn. So what white is trying to achieve here, Matt, is they do recognize in the past few turns, we played the c5 move that has weakened the d6 square. What white would like to do in the long term is build up pressure down the d file against our d pawn. So that's sort of white trying to create some counterplay and some imbalances in the position. We bring our rook to d8 because we want to reinforce our d6 pawn. And really, both sides are going to play natural moves from here. F3, blunting our bishop so that the F1 bishop can actually develop. We move our knight. It's going to come over to G6, and then we're going to break the pin when the bishop can't retreat and maintain the pin. Bishop E2, white is just continuing on the development. White does need to get castled at some point. We can now play H6, asking the bishop where it wants to go. And white has nothing better than capturing. If white doesn't capture and instead runs away, we come to G6 and gobble the bishop up anyway. White castles, and now we can break with D5. And in this position, the computer just gives zeros. Black is completely even. And there's a few, and it sort of just depends how white wants to proceed from here. They might want to retake in the middle, in which case we can consider taking with either the bishop or with the pawn. I would actually recommend taking with the pawn to give us the E6 square for our knight, where it will be very strong. And we can finish development with just rook c8. Very even position. And the reason we go through this line first is it really does demonstrate all of the themes of the Nimzo-Indian. So we give up the bishop pair, but we get a big lead in development. And when we use that development and the easy development that the Nimzo-Indian gives us to get all of our pieces to good squares and achieve two central pawn breaks, c5 and d5, very commonly, Matt, in the Nimzo, if black can achieve both c5 and d5, black is completely equal. And that's sort of exemplified in this line. We've given up the bishop pair to achieve rapid development, and that's allowed us to achieve 2 pawn breaks, and white has no claim for an advantage here.
Yeah, I like this line for black. I think it's something where we were constantly fighting for that initiative. White was a couple moves
Mhm.
behind in development.
White's always reacting.
Yeah, they're always reacting. So now I want to go back and look at move 13. When we played c takes d4, we mentioned e takes d4 as a possibility. Let's
Mhm.
look at this next because we have a nice idea here. We can start with pawn to h6, putting the question to the bishop on g5. And really the best move is to go back to h4. And now we can play our rook over to c8, freeing the f8 square for the queen in this case. So explain that, James. How is our queen coming to f8 in this line?
Yeah. So the reason we want to put the queen on f8 is, again, our weakest square, our weakest, it's really a pawn in this position, is d6. And so by bringing the queen to f8, we both break the pin on our f6 knight, but also keep the d6 pawn reinforced. And very commonly in both the Nimzo and the Queen's Indian, you'll either see bishop to f8, defending the d6 pawn from long range and sort of freeing up your 7th rank, or you'll see queen f8 doing double duty, what we're seeing now, breaking the pin and keeping d6 reinforced.
All right, so now let's go back and look at f3. I'm just going to take us back
I
to,
might just make a slight comment
yeah,
on this e takes d4, Matt.
yeah.
This is much more common at club level, but it's not the testing line. It's very natural to recapture with the pawn, but this D and C structure for white versus E and D for black favors black. We've got the extra central pawn, which is very nice, and we've got the C file pressure.
Yeah.
So this is very, very comfortable, and you'll be seeing this a lot. It's still a balanced middle game, but it's actually black now that has more central control than white, and it's black that has a little bit of pressure in the position. So this is really emblematic of what you're hoping to achieve in the Nimzo-Indian. All our pieces are on good squares. We have pressure on the white position.
And I think club level players don't always appreciate that long term pressure. Like, where's the pawn weakness in black's camp? We don't have one. Whereas white's pawn
Yeah,
weakness,
exactly.
c4. And that makes a huge difference. Like, we can just pressure, pressure, pressure c4, and they can't really do much in return.
Exactly.
Okay, should we go to f3 now on move 8?
Yes, please.
Okay, so we looked at e3 here. Now we're going to look at pawn to f3. And at first you might think never move the f pawn, right? Ben Feingold's taught us that. But there's a plan. White just wants to blast through with pawn to e4. But again, we can play this nice move, pawn to h6, putting the question right away to the bishop. And it looks like only bishop to f4, bishop to h4 holds a stockfish advantage. But most
Mhm.
players take, or what do most players do? Take her bishop back.
Yeah, it's I mostly face takes at the club level,
Uh-huh.
but white is advised to try and keep the bishop pair, because without the bishop pair and with another set of minor pieces coming off the board, white's space advantage doesn't count for very much because all of our remaining pieces will have enough good squares to develop to. And with the additional space white is taking comes the responsibility of guarding all of the weak squares left behind those pawns. And after you play e4, there's a lot more weak squares, particularly dark squares, and you've just given up your dark square bishop. So
Yeah.
white really should be preserving that bishop.
Okay, so let's look at bishop h4. Bishop h4, and we're going to go with pawn to d5. There's our first pawn break, right? First pawn break on the
Yes,
fifth rank.
exactly.
And then let's say e3 by white, most common move. And here we can play knight b to d7. So kind of simple development, but we're ready for this pawn break next, pawn to c5. And if you count the developing moves that white still has to play, bishop has to get out, knight has
There's a
to get
lot.
out, and castle. So 3 more moves for white to develop.
Yeah, exactly. And sort of again, and you will hear me say this again and again, Matt, if we can achieve c5, if we can achieve d5, we're at least equal. And I think one misconception about the Nimzo-Indian I hear a lot discussing the opening with like my fellow club players is there's a belief that, oh, it's a hypermodern opening. You control the center purely with pieces and you don't move your pawns in the middle.
Uh-huh.
It could not be further from the truth. While we initially fight for the e4 square with piece play, that's absolutely true. To equalize, we must play in the middle with pawns. And really what we're waiting for is for white to show us, well, which pawn breaks are going to be the most impactful.
You know what's funny about you mentioning that? The reason I quit playing the Nimzo when I gave it a short trial run is because I was playing a Simul, and one of my
Mhm.
opponents was rated like, I think he was 800-ish. And I played the Nimzo, and I was
Mhm.
only trying to use my pieces, and he played an F3 E4 line.
Oh yeah, yeah,
And I
yeah,
looked at the game after because he notated it, and he was crushing me right out of the opening. And I thought, oh, this Nimzo's not for me. But it's because I didn't appreciate getting not only the first pawn break, but then the second pawn break. I was just trying to use my pieces. So I think that's a really
yeah.
good tip for new Nimzo players.
It's where I see a lot of people go wrong picking up the opening because I think that's how it's often like sold or presented.
Yeah.
And that's actually not what the opening's about.
Okay. So
So
in
we've got
this,
knight b7 just developing our last piece, preparing c5. And again, these are fairly non-forcing positions. There are many, many ways white could continue, and we can't possibly cover every single move that white could play here. So we'll give a sample line that I think is quite illustrative. White will often take on d5, transforming the pawn structure. And you'll see this is pretty much always possible in different Nimzo-Indian positions after we play d5. And in this situation, we have a really, really, really nice move, sort of putting both queens on pre with knight takes d5.
that's
Um,
cool.
and you can actually continue without this if you can't find this over the board, if you can't remember it. But it's a really, really nice idea. And the reason I wanted to highlight it is recapturing in the middle with a knight when it attacks their queen is actually a thematic maneuver in both the Nimzo-Indian and the Queen's Indian. So there's quite a few lines in this repertoire map where this idea comes up. So I want to expose people to it now. And well, let's just see what happens if white exchanges. So bishop takes on d8, knight takes on c3. Obviously, don't forget to take their queen. That would be a disaster.
Yeah. Queen sack.
Bishop takes h4 is best, saving the bishop. And now we can just bring our knight back. And this transformation's actually been quite good for black because we're attacking e3, which is going to take white more time. Uh, natural to defend with bishop f2. And now we achieve our final pawn break. White is still many, many moves from finishing development of the king side. I think there are, I believe, 3 pieces on their starting squares and a dark square bishop that doesn't look too fantastic. White does not want a castle king side. I know the queens are off, but that looks terrifying. And so, yes, white has the bishop pair. White does not even have a space advantage here, and we have an enormous lead in development. So things have gone really, really well for black. And I believe Stockfish gives us about 0.3, which is just a completely negligible advantage, probably because of the 2 bishops.
Yeah,
If
the
I was,
bishop pair can count
um,
as 0.5, but in this case, they don't
yeah,
really have any strong diagonals. And I think it's our lead in development, like you said, that kind of negates that bishop pair. I would say it's less than
yeah,
0.3. Like, to me, this looks equal.
yeah. If you'd asked me to guess, I would have said completely even.
Mhm.
But the computer knows all, doesn't it? Sees much further than I do. I will just note back on move 13. Why do they not capture on c7?
Yeah.
Um, it's because we have the move knight d5 here, hitting both the e3 square and the bishop.
Oh, yeah. So
So we are
that would,
saving our piece with a very strong move. Now, oh sorry, yeah, and that's sorry, that was all I wanted to highlight. Is we are now going to take there, and then we'd be threatening both knight c2, but we can at least grab the bishop pair back. So we're getting back our material and getting the bishop pair, and black is at least equal there, probably slightly better. So that covers that line. Where would you like to go to next?
Let's go all the way back to move 6 now. So we'll look at B takes C3, and this was the one that I was really wondering about because even though white has the double pawns,
Yeah, yeah.
I see that quick threat. White wants to just play E4 right away, but you have a nice break in the center, starting with pawn to C5 this time. So why are we going C5?
Yeah, that's right. And by taking a step back, you've identified what is white's threat. That is E4 in one move, and we don't have a good way of preventing that. So we are going to have to live in the reality of a fast E4. And whenever white can achieve that, and there's another line in this chapter where white gets E4 in one move, we'll cover shortly. And there is the entire move for F3 Nimzo, where white can get E4 in one move as well. Whenever white is achieving E4 in one move, these are the lines where we cannot get by just on ideas. We do need to be very precise in our play. And so this is one example. And the idea of C5 is to both put pressure on the dark squares, but also to blockade the C4 pawn. So white does have a weakness. It is this C4 pawn. We're going to take control of the square in front of it and then achieve counterplay against white's position by fighting against this weak C4 pawn.
Yeah, when you see those pawns stacked, C4 and C3 with our pawn on C5, that's a scary position for white long term because positionally those C pawns being stuck is very bad.
Mm.
And we're not going to go out of our way to undouble those pawns for white. So
No,
they
that's why
should
we're
feel
not playing d5 to stop e4, because then white will just trade off the extra c pawn. And we're also, just on that, we're not going to go out of our way to win the c4 pawn anytime soon. That pawn is going to be there 40 moves from now.
yes.
So we're still going to be reactive. We're still going to be aware of what is white trying to achieve. We're not just going to blindly go and try and win the pawn. That would get us into a lot of trouble. That's a long-term advantage that we'll come back to.
Okay, so let's look at what happens if white just
The critical
immediately
move.
grabs the center. We're going to play pawn to d6 here. This kind of prevents white from playing e5, but also helps develop our minor pieces. Like we've seen before, a lot of times our knight wants to come to d7. So this is a pretty useful move. And if bishop to d3, we're going to play queen to c7. So again, kind of fighting for this dark square control, also preventing this. And I like that the queen is eyeing that potential weakness down the road with the c4 pawn.
Yeah. So we've given up our dark square bishop, and so a very common strategy in the Nimzo after giving up your dark square bishop is to actually put as many of your other pawns on dark squares as possible so that they complement your remaining light square bishop. But also, if we can achieve e5 and this central pawn blockade, white actually can't take advantage of their light square bishop because it will be stuck behind the e4 pawn. So that's a very common plan in the Nimzo as well, to blockade the middle, gum it all up, which means the knights are a little bit better than the bishops in the closed center position.
Mm-hmm. And I've heard a rule. I think it was Yasser Sirwan who mentioned this. I think it was if each side has under 7 pawns, then the bishops can be better than the knights on average.
Oh,
7 is like equal, 7 pawns each.
that's like the sweet spot. That's
Yeah,
really
but
interesting.
we got
Yeah.
all 8 on the board, and I love the idea of trapping a bishop long term like that. So let's
You're
say
going to see that happen a lot in these lines, actually. Yeah. We play against that bishop constantly. So knight e2, developing another minor piece. You will see club players play knight f3 here. The reason we're not covering it is it's not a critical move in the position, because we'll just play e5, gum up the middle, and then develop our remaining minor pieces. The reason I'm covering knight e2 is white's critical idea here is actually castles and then f4 and attacking just all out. And so the knight on f3 would only get in the way of that plan. So you should be worried about knight e2, not knight f3. And here we have, in this exact position, however, a really nice move to remember. And that move is b5.
ooh,
What do you think of b5, Matt?
I love b5. I mean, I've played the Benko quite a bit. I don't know if that's what you were thinking, but
Yeah. This is the inspiration. Yep.
Well, at first glance, it does look strange because I'm thinking, well, what happens if white just takes it? Could they just grab the pawn? But there's pawn to c4, and boom, the bishop is trapped. And that's going to get you some blitz wins. I can guarantee
Oh yeah.
you'll see that in blitz. But let's look at a more sensible move for white. Castle. What are we going to do here?
Yeah. So in this case, we will now take the pawn, and this is a good pawn trade for us. We're trading our pawns towards the middle. You'll probably get bishop takes c4 here. This does straighten out white's pawn structure, but again, we're actually starting to achieve a very comfortable position where we've got pressure against their position, and they don't yet have enough control of e5 to continue with a kingside attack. It's also buying us a little bit of time because this bishop, after c takes d4, would be loose with our queen lined up against it. They can recapture back with the pawn, but then there's actually very awkward pressure down the c file. And so we're going to take advantage of some of these tactical elements over the next few moves to just continue improving our position. And here we're recommending knight bd7, which is the end of the line. Stockfish gives black a half pawn advantage, which is really nice. And at the moment, we're really just looking to play moves like bishop b7, bring a rook to the c file, and then when the moment's right, take on d4 and have this really heavy pressure down the c file with all white's pieces lined up for us. All of our pieces are on good squares. After bishop b7, we've got really heavy pressure against e4. White was meant to be attacking us after achieving e4 in one move, Matt. And yet again, there is no attack for white, and their center is under heavy pressure, which is what we're trying to achieve in the Nimzo. They've taken all this space. With that space comes the responsibility of guarding the pawns, guarding the squares, and it looks like black is starting to win that tug of war.
Yeah, and I think that 0.5 eval from Stockfish is pretty exciting in these sort of positions too. Like we're playing for the win here.
It tells you where things are trending.
Mm-hmm. All right, so now let's go back. I jumped the gun earlier, but we're going to move 5.
Yeah,
And let's
all
look
good.
at pawn to e4. And I think,
Yes.
yeah, you have in your notes the critical try because white just says, all right, I'm going to play e4 in one move. So how are we going to fight against this?
Yeah, and just a little bit about this. This is the line that GMs are playing for an advantage. So in the entirety of Queen C2, as we've seen, black is so far pretty comfortably equalizing with natural moves, maybe even playing for a small advantage. So this is the current battleground for grandmasters. I am recommending the move 5d6. I will note the move 5d5 is the true battleground for grandmasters, but it does come with about 20 moves of computer theory that you have to know, and that's just completely unrealistic.
Yeah.
And very, very slightly worse than that is the move 5d6. But you know who played 5d6 and had a ridiculously good score with it, Matt? It was Anatoly Karpov. So if
Oh,
it was good
yeah.
enough for Karpov, it's probably good enough for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a so in my very, very first ever OTB classical game, so I was unrated and I was playing in the under 1700 division. And so I got paired against one of the highest seeds. I think she was a 1650 versus me unrated. And I actually had a game in this line that I won with the black pieces using 5d6. So I really, really like this. It's very simple to play, and black gets really nice positions without having to know 20 moves of computer theory. So highly recommend this one. And all we're trying to do is have this d6 e6 structure where we have our own, nice control of the middle, and we're going to eventually play for e5 to balance out the space advantage.
Yeah.
So
So in this,
there are. Oh yeah, you go. Sorry.
I was just saying, I think we're going to look at 4 moves here for white, right? We're going to
Yeah.
look at pawn to a3, bishop to d3, pawn to e5, and knight to f3. And the main move is pawn to a3, which has some similarities to the line we just looked at because it's like, okay, they're going to kick our bishop right away. And just like last
Mhm.
time, we take on c3. You don't want to get this bishop trapped. It's a warning for you guys.
No,
Don't
no.
drop it back. So take on c3 with check. B takes c3. And that move is forced because if the queen takes, we have knight takes
You
e4.
drop the e4 pawn. Yep.
Yep. Now we're going with c5. So why are we choosing c5 in this position?
So very similar to other lines we've looked at. We need to immediately start putting pressure on their center. And by getting in c5 first, we've got that pawn break in. We might now continue with a move like knight c6. Whereas if you play knight c6 first, you're just not putting as much pressure. You're not fighting for as much space. And very commonly, we'll actually play c5 and e5 to completely block up the middle, again, highlighting, well, what do you do with your light square bishop? It's now completely stuck behind its own pawns. It's more precise to start with c5 because it's a prelude to both queen c7 and knight c6. So c5 more accurate than e5.
And I like this plan too because it's like this move c5 because we're playing with a plan in mind, right? We just have this
Oh yeah,
strategy like dark square blockade, and we're not focused too much on d5, all the sharp tactics. We're just going to play this positionally.
yeah. It's very very positional, and this actually does score better for black in the database. Black's doing really well with d6. I think because the D5 lines, it's a gunslinger fight, and whoever misremembers their theory or makes a tactical mistake, you just lose. It's
Mhm.
that sharp. With D6, you're just executing a plan, and you're going to get to a comfortable position that you hopefully know the ideas better, and you just outplay your opponent. So bishop d3, your white is just developing. I will note that they can play d5 here, closing the middle. This is a common mistake. Uh, you actually have dealer's choice. You can play e5 here if you prefer that structure, but I think in this exact situation with white's king still in the middle, e takes d5, trying to start opening the center makes more sense to me. They should retake with the c pawn, and you can actually just take with knight e4 here because if queen takes runs into, I can put it on the board. Queen takes runs into rook e8, and black just wins.
Ouch.
So yeah, ouch. Yeah. So they can't push in the middle, which is a common theme. Again, we're so far ahead in development versus their map. We're going to be able to take advantage of that. They've made a lot of pawn moves. I count 5 pawn moves. So we do have that nice lead in development. Now the queen will come to c7. So this is preparing e5. It's also starting to build pressure down that c file, and it's reinforcing our dark squares. We don't have a dark square bishop, so we want to have as much control over the dark squares as we possibly can. Again, knight e2, more critical than knight f3. White needs to play with f4 to generate that big kingside attack. And here we have that b5 idea again. So whenever you see knight e2 and bishop d3, you should be thinking, it won't work every time, but is this an occasion where I can get in b5? And here it does work, and we get a very comfortable position.
That's such a cool. I've never seen b5 in the Nimzo. I like this idea a lot. Okay, so let's look at the more natural, maybe for players who aren't as booked up from the white side. More natural move,
Yeah.
knight f3. And it looks like one of their ideas to complete development is bishop to g5. So I see you have recommended here h6. Let's not allow
Yeah.
anything into g5. And after castle, on to b6. So we're going with that dark square strategy like you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it looks like, are we going to put the bishop on b7 or what's the long-term plan?
Yeah. We can put the bishop on b7, but I wouldn't necessarily do it immediately because something Michael Adams, who is a Nimzo Queen's Indian, legend, one of the leading ideas pioneers, he actually likes to, in this exact sort of position, play e5 and then bring the bishop out on this diagonal.
Ah,
The idea being that this dark square bishop will now not have any good squares. This light square bishop will not have any good long-term prospects, And white is naturally inclined to close the middle with d5. So he likes to play e5 first, and then when white is invited to close the middle, bring the bishop out on this diagonal. And in that situation, with the entire center like blocked up, black actually has plans like knight h7 and f5. And it's actually black that's playing for a win there, not white,
I love
which sort of
those.
highlights again why knight f3 is not the most accurate, because it slows down white's attack so much.
I love those V-shaped pawn structures too. Like if we have pawns on E5,
Yeah, yeah,
D6,
yeah.
C5, and they have these three pawns, and then like you said, pawn to F5, and that kind of reminds me of an old Benoni structure.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty nice.
A
Okay,
little bit of a Benoni, a little bit of a King's Indian type feel, where you don't have the passive bishop on G7, which is strategically quite nice. And if everything trades off, you still have this long-term C4 pawn weakness that you can go after.
yep. Okay, so now let's just briefly mention back here on move 6. We just looked at
Yep.
A3. Let's just briefly mention knight to F3. If they play this, we can play pawn to E5 right away. And this
Yeah.
transposes back to if they would have started with knight F3 on move 5. We go
Mm-hmm.
D6 and then they go E4. So we're just mentioning that transposition. So if you're training in chessable or you're wondering, hey, are you going to mention knight F3? That's what you need to do. Just go to that line.
Yeah. Yeah. So we will cover that in detail shortly, because it's a pretty critical. It's a very, well, not critical, but common try. And then we've also got, where is
6
it?
E5 probably is we should look at
Yeah,
next.
E5 here. Thank you. And so I think you will see this sometimes. This is a line to remember. This is probably the most critical try, because our last move, D6, was saying you can't play E5 on good terms. And White's saying, I think I can play E5 on good terms. I don't believe you. So this is a little bit more move by move than most of the repertoire. So if you were going to do a chessable trainable, this is a line I would recommend having, in your trainables. So we're going to take opening the middle, where we're leading in development quite significantly, so it makes sense to open the center. White retakes, and now we have knight g4, just putting pressure on this pawn, and we're now going to have to play with a lot of dynamicism, a lot of activity, but to compensate for this very cramping pawn on e5. But as you'll see, it's all natural moves and it's going to work out well. So white starts by defending with knight f3, just makes sense. We develop another piece, again threatening to take. Couldn't be more natural. White needs to defend. I will say I have had 2 online games in this line, and in both games, White just didn't bother defending the pawn and just gambited it. And they do have some compensation, but it's not enough. So they really do need to play bishop f4 and try to hold onto the pawn. And this is why this move coming up is why I would say it's a little bit more move by move. You do need to find knight d4 here. Black is a little bit, it's an only move to keep the balance, but it does keep the balance. I think it's fairly easy to find, in like a classical game, if you're just looking for candidate moves, but it's just a good one to remember. Black is a little bit worse or much worse after other moves. So I've tried to build the repertoire with very, very few must remember moves, but this is one to remember. And now queen d2. White has other moves. Queen d2 is the critical attempt to keep the balance. They can move the queen to other squares. It's just an even position. Queen d2 is, again, if they know the theory, if they're booked up, queen d2 is the only testing move for black. Black is equal after all other moves.
And that's not an
Here we can just
obvious
take.
move. Queen D2 is not an
No,
obvious
it's not an
move.
obvious move. Yeah.
I,
They need to know the theory. And this is why this line is so good. We're just playing natural moves with one move to remember. They actually do need to know all the computer lines, or they're much worse, which is really nice.
yeah,
That's why I beat the 1650 as a like 1300, because she didn't know all the computer moves and I could just play natural moves, and the burden of proof was on her to be much more precise in a position that she'd never seen before.
Mm-hmm.
So we can take, messing up their pawn structure, take the queen. King takes is the only good move. And so now we've entered a very balanced endgame. The computer gives this just all zeros, but I thought we'll go a little bit deeper in this line, Matt. Firstly, because it's already a simplified position, and I think it's good for the viewers to sort of see where does their study actually begin, because we're getting to like move 12 to 15 here with all forcing moves, not having to really, you'll just bang all these moves out, and you'd actually start studying from the final position that we give you, which is well into the end game. Just highlighting our knight is attacked, so needs to retreat.
And that's a
I spent,
good one to
there
memorize
you go.
that too, because it looks like knight takes f2 as a move, but it's not a terrible move. But that knight is getting a little bit trapped back there. And this one, it's like,
Yeah, so I did really, really want to recommend Knight F2, and I actually
yeah,
left my computer with the most up-to-date version of Stockfish sitting on it for more than an hour just to go to the, what's the maximum depth I can get to.
uh-huh.
Because it has been played by titled players,
Okay,
but I think around depth 40 to 50, the computer's pretty firm that Knight H6 with the intention of coming to F5 is the strongest idea in the position. Now, if you play knight f2, it's certainly not fatal. The piece is not getting trapped, but you do have to play quite precisely from there, and it's just not as strong as knight h6.
yeah.
And knight h6 actually forces white to give up the bishop pair because the threat of knight f5 is so powerful. Rook g1 has been played every single time in the database, so that's an easy one. King h8. These moves are relatively equal. As you can see, it's been a fairly long, fairly forcing sequence. I think we're on move 14. Bishop d3 is white's only good move, according to the engine. And the idea is actually just to bring the bishop to e4, which is going to make development of our queenside minor pieces more challenging. And again, I had the engine on this for a very, very long time. There are many moves that Black has played here. Black has a good score. You can play f5, you can play f6, you can play c6, you can play bishop d7. They're all pretty even. Black is doing really well statistically here. But after quite a bit of research, playing through some games and leaving the engine on, my recommendation is f6. And that's because we actually just want to take here and then have pressure down the F file. That seems to be the strongest and the cleanest plan for Black in this position. And so the game might continue something like E takes F6, Rook takes F6. Both sides have weaknesses. Black does have the two bishops, which is very nice. You don't get that so often in the Nimzo. And I mean, we are going to be able to double up rooks on these two weak pawns. That gives us plenty of counterplay.
You know what I like about this line playing pawn to f6 too? A lot of people would think, oh, I should get that bishop out through b7. I should fianchetto
Yeah,
it. But it's a little bit more positionally nuanced to understand, okay, we could actually play f6. That's going to open up our rook down the f file. And if this e pawn moves up just one square, the bishop
yeah, the
comes out
bishop's a
much
monster.
more smoothly towards the center. So
Yeah,
I really like that f6 move quite a bit.
yeah. I will. So I think it can be very easy as a Nimzo-Indian player, especially because we're pairing the Nimzo with the Queen's Indian, to always want to put your bishop on b7. But that's slow. And very often, if you can achieve d6, e5 and bring the bishop out via its starting diagonal, that's usually actually a stronger plan. B6, bishop b7 is a plan that we often go for because it's the only viable plan. But we should be trying to remain open to other possibilities.
But let's go back to move 12. So in ChessGoals courses, we do like to show some of the common mistakes, especially at the
Oh
club
yeah,
level. Like these are courses for club level players, not for
exactly.
grandmasters. What happens if bishop takes d2, a very common move?
So this recapture just hangs material. We can just take the e pawn. And
Very
this has
good.
been played a lot in the club database because people don't want to lose their right to capture. But not only that, Matt, you'll notice the knight's now hitting two more sort of fairly key squares. The knight's really, really active. So we're not only up material, but we have threats in the position as well. And black has a big advantage here.
So smooth. It's just that knight. I love a dominant knight in the center like that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so now let's go back to when white played queen to d2. So in this position, queen d2 is the strongest move, like James mentioned. Queen d3 looks a little bit more natural because your queen does guard the knight as white.
Mm-hmm.
So if knight takes, maybe the queen takes back. What are we going to do in this case?
So all of our play so far has been ganging up on this e pawn. We just want to keep applying pressure to the e pawn. And I would also highlight this king is still in the middle. So anything we can do to keep opening up the center of the board, good for black. So Matt, you're the title player in the conversation. I need you to find a candidate move that attacks e5 and opens up the middle.
You're hitting
What
me.
comes to mind?
You're hitting me on one of my chess weaknesses, James. Like this, I've had YouTube videos on this. Play pawn to f6. Not just this position, but it's this structure in general. When white has an e5 pawn and black has an e6 pawn, it's almost always a good idea. This is modern chess engines telling us this. Like you got
Yeah,
to play f6, open up that center, open up that f8 rook. So it's got to be pawn to f6 here, right?
got to be pawn to f6. It's very, very strong. And you might, for players watching, you might, well, what about my e pawn? It might become weak.
Mm-hmm.
Well, once the e pawn is gone, we're going to be able to continue with this pawn up the board and use it as a battering ram against white's position. But it's also defended. Oh, sorry, it's also defended by our light square bishop. So again, highlighting we don't need to develop the bishop to b7. It's very often very strong coming out on this diagonal. So yeah, f6 is the best, and white has one move to really stay in the game. It's rook d1, putting pressure on our knight, so counter-attacking. Taking would be a disaster. It just brings more material, more attacking pieces. It opens up the center. White is much worse there. And now we can just take, the pawn defends the knight. And this is just an even position. We can always just keep liquidating pieces with knight takes f3, bringing the other knight back around, pushing in the middle. We've got a rook. It's just a very good position for black. We've already completely equalized. White still cannot castle, and we're the one we've got the threats in the position. The computer says equal because with computer wisdom, it can navigate this position very comfortably. But I think practically speaking, this is a very desirable position for black. You're not risking much. White could easily go wrong on any single move.
Yeah, I would much rather play black here. I think white is kind of walking the tightrope in this position, trying to
Yeah,
figure out how do I hold equality. So this is the last line for move 6, e5. So now we're going to circle back and look at, I think it was bishop to d3 next. Yeah, bishop to
yeah.
d3. Okay, so there's a threat here I'm already looking at. Pawn to
It
e5.
is a big threat.
Yeah, kicking the knight and threatening bishop takes h7 check. And it feels like, James, we need one of our central pawn breaks here, not a move like knight to c6. Is that right?
That's right. So we have to be aware of the what's going on in the position. But we've talked a lot about the c5 pawn break, but we've also talked a lot about c5 in combination with e5. And in this exact situation, Matt, it's actually e5 that you want to remember. It's a very easy move to find, of course, because it blockades all of the pressure on the light squares. And this is actually how my first game went that I won. In the long run, strategically, this is really, really nice for black because you're blocking up the center. The bishops are not very, very good, and you're going to have very nice, easy, natural play. Overwhelmingly, the main move here is d5, taking space. Capturing is not very good. I will just briefly mention that after takes, you want to play at some point later c6, and that means your pawn here is going to control d4 and the pawn on c6 is going to control d5. So white cannot make use of any central squares, but black can occupy d4 with a piece. Black's doing really, really well in that structure. That is why overwhelmingly people do push with d5.
Can I
The
can I
exchange only helps black.
I show that on the board
Sorry.
quick? Okay, so D takes,
Yeah, yeah,
D
please.
takes. I'm just gonna give white a move. Let's give knight e2 just
I
because it
think
doesn't threaten our
92 makes sense.
c6. This
Yeah,
is a really good point. The way this pawn controls the squares for that knight, and this pawn does not control this potential square for our pieces, it's almost always an advantage. So when you see those double E pawns, the c6 pawn is almost always better than that pawn on c4. So just remember that.
yeah,
Like positionally, that's a nice thing to face when they take. Okay, so back to the line.
yeah. Very, very, very positionally desirable.
Yeah.
Especially because you're still retaining the blockade on e4. So this light square bishop is still not very good. So d5. And here I'm recommending knight a6. Not the only move, but it's a little bit, it's a little bit fancy, I suppose. We're just going to come to c5. You can, look, to be honest, you can completely do it via d7 as well. The reason knight a6 is very slightly more precise is it does leave this diagonal open for our bishop.
Oh yeah, that's a nice
But
point.
knight bd7 has been played by GMs. Is a very, very small computer difference between the lines. Not a big deal. So knight e2 again. Again, why not knight f3? Well, white needs to drum up play against our king. The knight would just be getting in the way. In my game versus the 1600, she played knight f3, and I was the only one with active play throughout the entire game because she could just never commence an attack. And now I really, really like knight h5 because we're not allowing bishop g5, which would be how white continues development. It's much more active than playing h6, and we're actually preparing f5. It's going to be us that breaks in the middle, Matt. And we're going to have this nice open f file. We've got a knight that can come to f4, and we're taking advantage of this bishop on c8.
And the way you can remember that f5 pawn break, this is kind of pawn structures in general. When you see this pawn chain pointing kingside, and these pawns are locked up for white, that cues you in. You should look to play f5, and white should be looking to push these pawns over on the queen side. That's kind of the typical plan when you see those pawn diagonals. That one for white and ours going towards the king side.
So, Matt, you know a lot about chess. You've been around a long time. Is there another defense against d4 that has this structure?
Oh, this looks just like a King's Indian defense to me.
Yeah, but could I ask you to compare the plight of the dark square bishops in these respective positions?
Yeah, so King's Indian defense, typically you would see this bishop sitting over on g7. And it would be
Yeah.
boxed in by these pawns. And now we have this option to trade off for a knight in a super closed position where, like we've talked about, the knights tend to be better than the bishops. So
Mm-hmm.
I would prefer this position over a King's Indian any day. And I think
Yeah,
Stockfish agrees.
exactly. So basically, what's happened is white has allowed us to play into a improved King's Indian where we don't have to have the passive dark square bishop, and we're already playing f5, commencing that King's Indian style kingside attack. And just to be clear, our plan is not to take on e4; it's actually to keep pushing and open lines and f4, g5, g4 sort of thing. But this is a really, really nice position. White normally castles. We can improve our knight. Knights on the rim are dim, but knights on c5 are alive. And a3, just forcing the exchange of dark square bishops. We obviously take. Retreating doesn't lead to anything. White captures back. We can take out the light square bishop. The reason we're doing that is to make f5 hit with more impact. We're removing a defender of the f5 square. Queen recaptures and f5. And Stockfish already gives black a nice advantage over half a pawn. there's nothing to not like about this position. Black's really comfortable.
Yeah, this looks great. And I think another thing to notice with that trade on D3, because at first glance, people might be wondering, why would we trade this good knight
Oh, sure.
for this bad bishop? One of the reasons, like you said, is, white has three defenders on the f5 square. I
Hmm.
think another important thing to note is this knight is very quickly going to get kicked. And we
Yeah,
still have a few pieces fighting for squares. So if that knight has to go back to d7, trapping our bishop, that's not good. So
no
I
good.
think that gives us more space too to eliminate that knight in addition to the quick f5 break.
Yeah. And as is very common in the Nimzo, everything is just flowing together really nicely. We've been able to parlay early piece activity into key pawn breaks. We've taken back some space, and the entire time we've been posing problems for white. We're fighting for the initiative, and in the very final position, we're going to carry out a kingside attack. It might not win, but we're the one pressing for the attack.
Yeah, this looks fun. I like those King's Indian style attacks on the king side. All right, so
I
here,
mean, you either win by checkmate or it's a draw, so life's good.
yeah, exactly, two result game. So here we looked at castle. Let's look at next what happens if white immediately kicks the bishop. We got to be careful about that bishop being trapped. He's not
Yeah,
quite trapped, but we got to be careful. So here you're recommending to capture the knight. Is that right?
yeah. There's just not a good retreat because if you come back to a5, then b4 follows, and you're just out of squares.
Yeah. Okay, so we take the knight. Queen takes c3, most common move. And here we're going to play knight to c5, again kicking the bishop. And as white, I would think, well, we just saw that line where black took d3 and played f5, so maybe I should take this opportunity, drop the bishop back. But here we're still going ahead with f5, same as the last line.
Yeah, no reason not to, and this works tactically because if white plays b4, we can just take like knight takes e4, and that's fine for us. Um, we'd be grabbing a central pawn and opening the f file for our rook. We'd also be eliminating the light square bishop, which would otherwise be quite an active piece. So we're very happy with that trade. And yeah, we're just continuing on, Matt, where white can only castle into our attack. So we're all steam ahead. All of our pieces are um, coming into the position.
I have a tactical question here. What happens if white takes twice on f5? Could they play g4? So let's say takes, bishop takes, bishop takes, rook takes. Could they get away with this little fork? And I have Stockfish running. There is a crazy move here, James. Rook takes f2, blows apart white's position.
Yeah, I think it's. I was like, I actually didn't know. It's not in my notes, so I was just
Yeah,
going into my solving,
yeah,
and yeah, I think it just has to be because you also have Queen H4 available in the position as well. So
yeah,
now you can bring your final rook in, and yes, we're down material, but this just looks completely over. Like I think rook takes f2 is just such a natural idea in the position. It just looks completely overwhelming.
yeah. And that's like so we're -4 or -5 territory. But that's a good one to know, I guess, because you might see someone go for that. But yeah, rook takes f2 just completely blows white apart. That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right, so now
Yeah, that
let's.
does happen a lot in these again because I know I'm repeating myself a lot. We just have an enormous lead in development, and very often you can then convert that lead in development into a big attack with a material investment.
Yeah, and one thing I love about just all of these Nimzo lines, not just this chapter, the Nimzo has been good throughout the history of time. Like the Nimzo was good in every previous era of chess, and the computers have not figured out any sort of refutation. It's like the best top computer line in all of chess. If white goes d4,
Yeah,
c4, knight c3, you play Nimzo. So we're holding equal from a base. And then when white messes up, it's like, boom, we got a big advantage. Whereas like King's
yeah,
Indian defense or Benko, you fight from a big negative, and sometimes it's like you just fight to get equal when white makes a mistake. but we're starting equal. That's really kind of cool.
Yeah, and this is, so we're in the classical variation with four queen c2. This is the like the oldest and most established variation for white. And white gets no advantage. Like, I didn't find any lines where white gets an advantage, and so you actually don't see this too much at the top level anymore. It's a little bit solved, and it's been solved in favor of black. It's only got better for black with modern engines.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think this was recommended in a book I had from the white side. It was like a strategic chess repertoire by John Watson. I think he
Mm-hmm.
recommended Queen C2 was like a positional way to play it for white, but yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
doesn't really fight for an edge. So should we go now to Bishop G5?
Yeah, yeah, critical. Now, so we've been talking about all these big attacks, but we have to go back to what are our opening principles? What is this opening about? Well, it's about fighting for the e4 square. And if we count up control of the e4 square, um, right now there is one piece controlling e4, and it is the queen. This knight can't fight for e4 because it's pinned. Our knight can't fight for e4 because it's pinned. So white has a threat here. They're going to play e4. We need to take action, and we don't have time for bishop sorry, b6, bishop b7. We need to take a decisive move now, and there are other moves. I'm recommending c5. Why? Well, it's how we meet this idea elsewhere in the repertoire and within this chapter, so it's going to be consistent for us. I will note d5 is a move in the position as well, if you want to expand your repertoire. And I guess just on that point, this may seem like, oh, there's a lot of theory in the Nimzo. If you think there's a lot of theory from the black side, Matt, from the white side, on every move, black has 4 or 5 options that
Mm-hmm.
white needs to know how to respond to. And that's one of the big appeals of the Nimzo. We're going to consistently go for this E6, D6, B6 structure, the queen, basically the Queen's Indian setup. But your opponent doesn't know that.
Yeah,
And lots of Nimzo players go for lots of different things. And so white, in going into the Nimzo, needs to know so much more than black just to get a playable position,
that's why I
which is
play
kind of
Catalan.
crazy.
That's why I go
Yeah, it's white.
Catalan
Yeah,
as white.
that's
I don't.
Catalan, very good choice.
Yeah, I don't want to face the Nimzo. That's for sure.
You sidestep all this nonsense.
We're kind of going
Um,
for that like Sicilian-esque pawn structure again here, right? The C and
yeah,
D
yeah, yeah, yeah.
pawns would trade
It's
off.
Sicilian Khan, where it's like E6. No,
Yeah, Sicilian Khan
it's
is
definitely Sicilian.
E6 and A6 is the Khan, or it could be the Taimanov, one of those structures. So now we're going to look at two moves for white. Pawn to E3 and D takes C5. They're both going to get 2 lines of coverage. Let's start with the more common E3. And I like your recommendation here, James. C takes D4 right away, immediately. What's the idea?
Yeah, we are forcing white to recapture with the pawn, and we're achieving that desirable pawn structure of D and C versus E and D with C file pressure for us.
Yes.
So we're basically getting that Sicilian pawn structure with the long-term advantages that brings positionally. We have more central control, but also we have the open C file to attack with. So we just have the best of both worlds. We're getting the center control, and we're getting the dynamic play. So it's just a very favorable structural transformation for us.
And the computer agrees with you too. Like it's already saying, not only are you equal, but I'm watching the engine and it keeps bouncing to the minus zero point 0.1 range, right? So it's 0 or minus 0.1. White's the one saying, I'd be happy with the equality at this point. But here again, we're going to kick the bishop on to h6. So I would say bishop h4, probably the critical line. And now,
Yeah. So again, and this comes up a lot throughout the repertoire, they can just take on f6, and we'll play queen takes f6. Why would white be better here? Only
yeah,
black can be better in this position. So we don't cover it because you don't need to know anything to be better. You've already black not only has all the advantages already discussed, we've now got the bishop pair as well.
and that's a
So
good bishop pair. That's like a
that's a
valuable bishop pair.
really, yeah, it's open center.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so bishop
So
h4.
h6, they should drop back.
Yep.
Yeah, and now b6. And again, we want to be fighting for the e4 square. They can't play e4 anyway. That's not the idea. But it's just the square itself is so critical in these structures, and control of the square is a big strategic objective for both sides. Also, to be honest, not so easy for this light square bishop to develop along this diagonal. So it just makes sense to put it on b7, where it'll be a very, very strong piece. Knight f3, white is just developing. Bishop b7, the bishop goes to its best square. Bishop e2. This is, in this exact situation, much better than bishop d3. And I want to mention two things why that is the case. On d3, it would be exerting pressure on h7, but we don't have an h7 pawn. So that's not particularly helpful. But additionally, something I think a lot of players can struggle with when they take up the Nimzo and Queen's Indian is they're very, very reluctant to play bishop takes f3. Because it's like, oh, I'm giving up my prize bishop.
Yeah.
But bishop takes f3 really, really weakens the white king and often leads to some very big attacks from black. So white playing bishop e2 reinforces that knight and just shows awareness of that sort of idea in the position. So in this position, bishop e2 is much better than bishop d3.
Yeah, just to go like
and
one move
yeah,
deeper, knight c6 already hits d4.
Targets that, yeah.
And if the pawn moves, knight e5 hitting f3 and d3, you can very quickly feel this advantage. And Stockfish says minus 1.3 already for black.
Yeah, you also have ideas as well of g5, knight h5, and sorry, the knight coming into f4 as a big attack. So
yeah.
We're trying to like dispel some like myths about the Nimzo and the Queen's Indian. So we've talked about, yes, you actually do need to move your pawns in the middle. Pawn play in the middle is really critical in these openings. And another thing is, do not be too committed to that bishop on b7. It's a really nice piece. But you know what's better than a really nice piece is checkmate. And yes. Taking on f3 is really, really strong when it's available.
That's a great tip. Okay, so bishop e2.
So yeah, bishop e2 makes sense. Now we're actually just going to preserve our bishop. We would like to play d5. So we've already achieved our c5 pawn break. So what's our next strategic objective? d5. But we don't want to hang our bishop out to dry. So we actually retreat our bishop first. And the other point being, we would like to play d5 when after c takes d5, we can recapture with the knight. Knight takes, bishop takes, and then white has an isolated queen's pawn position map.
Yep.
But we can't do that if our knight is pinned. So we bring back the bishop first, unpinning our knight. We're going to continue with d5.
That makes it easy to remember. Yeah, break the pin, and then you play d5 with the knight on f6 ready for the recapture. And that kind of looks like the Caro-Kann Panov structure, right? If you get the pawn on d5.
But does white set up their pieces like this in the Panov?
No, they don't.
No.
They play more active.
This is a really bad, like this is like a nightmare Panov for white, because you've got all the weaknesses but none of the active play.
So they got to act quick here. All right, so let's say castle by white. And I see your recommendation is knight to c6, putting the knight on a super active square, hitting this pawn. And it looks like now we're probably just ready to play here right away. This knight can go to b4, come back to d5. It looks beautiful.
You could just play d5, but you can sort of have some challenges with the intermezzo move, bishop takes f6, where you don't have knight capturing back on d5.
Yep.
So I think it's slightly better to play knight c6 first, so that we have our own intermezzo, knight b4 recapturing on d5.
And I think we do show, let's see, we show rook a d1, and then we show d5 for white. Okay, so let's start with rook a d1 first.
So rook a d1, now d5, and we actually do get similar positions to this in some of our other chapters, which is good. There is a real consistency in the structures that we've aimed for. The Nimzo can go in a million different ways. I have selected lines, Matt, that give us only a couple of different structures, so we can be masters in, the readers, the viewers, they'll be masters in those structures and know the plans and where the pieces go and what the ideas are much better than their opponents. But here we're getting an IQP, and it's an IQP by force, and so white is going to have the long-term weakness of the isolated pawn, but without the kingside attack. And a really nice tactical point is we always can play knight b4 and then bring the knight back to d5, getting a really strong outposted knight as well, and then liberating our bishop. From here, just like simple plans, rook c8. Depending what white does, you make a queen move. Sometimes, often, you're trying to move the bishop first and then put the queen on e7. But it's just a middle game where you have the long-term positional pull. The better player will win, but black does have an advantage long-term in this position.
And a really nice idea in these kind of almost IQP positions, right, where white's waiting to take on d5. Rook c8, like you mentioned, and knight a5 can be super useful as a way to just like immediately put the question to this pawn. And I kind of wanted to show that in between move that we had as well. If white captures here and we take and then go c takes d, we don't want to play e takes d, giving ourselves this isolated pawn. This is where we have that cool move, knight b4. Queen moves somewhere, and now the knight comes back to take. Super good IQP position, right? That pawn is stuck. We got the bishop pair, and white has no kingside attack like James was talking about earlier. So zero compensation at all for the pawn. It's like minus 0.6 already.
Yeah, and I think just very naturally you would have moves like queen e7 and then just centralizing the two. Like,
yeah,
pretty mindless. Don't really have to think about it. Black is just better with natural moves.
Yep, I agree with you. All right.
And I guess like a point going all the way back is this is meant to be a line where white gets a big kingside attack. They're playing e4. They're trying to apply pressure to us. Have we seen a big attack from white yet?
No, not yet.
No.
The scariest thing I think was when we doubled their F pawns. And it was like maybe there's a half open G file, but nothing was going to come of that. We were attacking still.
Yeah.
So I think we were now going back to move number 12. So let's see. I'll just back this up this way. Make sure I'm on the right move. Okay, so rook a d1 and pawn
we do need to show this.
d5 were the options here.
So let's look. This is the critical try. This is what you would expect a titled player to play, but it's only played 3% of the time by club players, and that I think is because it does take very precise calculation to know that this is playable. So
good that you show it then, because this could be dangerous. Like, good one to memorize.
Could be dangerous.
Yeah.
So the recommended antidote, why do we put the knight on c6? It is to play knight b4. And this actually doesn't add one additional attacker to d5. It adds two additional attackers to d5, the knight and the bishop. So this is usually why white doesn't go for it. You have to be pretty confident this works. Otherwise, you are just losing your central pawns.
Yeah.
Queen d2, the queen has to move. And it really has to move to the d file to reinforce the d pawn. So other moves do just lose material. We can take. It was attacked 4 times, so we'll take and force white to prove that their line works.
And d6 was a huge threat there too, trapping our bishop.
Yeah,
be aware of that.
Trapping the bishop. A3. White needs to find this in-between move to remove an attacker, or they are losing material. And so the knight's forced to retreat. Only has one good square. We don't want to we don't want to close the bishop off. So knight a6, just highlighting that the knight's going to come back into the game via c5 or c7. So it's only temporarily offside. Nothing to worry about there. Knight on a6 is very common in these openings for some reason. The knight just always seems to end up on a6 and then come back into the game. So you'll get very comfortable with that. Don't worry. And now they need to find bishop takes f6 because, again, we actually still do have too much control of d5. Bishop takes f6. Now the knight can take on d5 finally, and white's position is just okay. And here we are recommending the continuation from a top level game, knight c5, just bringing our worst piece back into the game. And this is just a 0.0 position. And this is from Ivanisevic Navarra in 2015, which did end in a draw. So even with best play for white, just an even position.
Right, that was the critical D5 try that you really have to know your
That's the
stuff.
critical
Yeah.
attempt, yeah.
And here's a nice point about bringing the knight back to A6. The knight on A6 allowed this bishop to stay open on the diagonal, and the knight actually found arguably an even better outpost, this C5 square, like threatening knight B3, tying E4. It could even go to E6, so don't worry about the knight on A6 for one move. Like, if he has the C5 square, he's going to be just fine.
Yeah, this comes up a lot in the Nimzo and Queen's Indian. The knight coming to A6 and then coming back into the game is a recurring theme. And so over time, you will build up familiarity with how to best reactivate that piece.
So now I think we're going back to move 6. Yeah, we looked at E3. Now let's look at D takes C5. So white grabs the pawn right away. I think a lot of players, before knowing what to do in the Nimzo, might think, oh, I should just recapture that pawn. But that's not the best move, is it?
It's not in the spirit of the opening. It is a playable move. It has been played, which I guess shows just how good Black's position is. But the best move, it's funny actually, great segue, Matt. The best move in this position is actually just knight a6.
Great.
And we're not going to recapture the pawn right away. We're going to bring another piece into the game. We're going to keep the emphasis on rapid development.
And you'll see this like in some white openings too, when the C4 pawn gets captured, and white will go knight A3 and capture back on C4 in that same way. So now let's look at pawn to A3 by white. Put in the question to this bishop. He doesn't want to be trapped. So you could play bishop takes C5. You could play queen to A5, just like utilizing this pin.
Yeah.
But we're going to take on C3. So why are we okay taking here, given the bishop pair in this line?
Just for very concrete reasons, we're going to, after the queen takes and we take on c5, we've got this huge threat of knight e4. So just very concretely, it works well for us, and we don't want to lose time. Our advantage in these positions is the lead in development in exchange for the bishop pair. And so we're going to play consistently with that theme, which is going to help the viewers remember the key ideas. We're okay giving up the bishop pair as long as we get a big lead in development.
So let's say here, let's look at the top move for white. What if they go bishop takes f6? I think students are going to wonder this too, because now are we going to have to accept doubled f pawns, and should we be afraid of having the only doubled pawns on the board?
So this is actually the line Hikaru plays as white. Okay. And it's which is quite funny. This is a line at the top level. It's considered to be white groveling for a draw. So you can just go into this with confidence. Remember, we've got the black pieces. We're happy to equalize. And if we can equalize, then try and play for an advantage. We shouldn't be starting every single game thinking, I've got the black pieces, I've got to get the full point. That's a little bit unrealistic. But after the natural recapture and allowing them to go into this endgame, we have equalized. And, you may well be able to outplay your opponent from this position. And I would also highlight there is a big difference in development between the two respective camps.
You know, we haven't mentioned enough yet, James. Stats at the club level. How are the stats looking in this position?
Not good for white. I believe black is winning 50% of the time, white 38% with the remainder draws. So a pretty crushing score for black.
Yeah, extra 12% win rate. I'll take that.
And well,
Okay.
you've had to do nothing either, right? You've just played natural moves out of the opening, and now you're getting a pretty comfortable endgame.
Yeah. That's something that I've been appreciating more and more, James, too, is like taking the opponents to the end game, especially with those kind of small advantages, and just being able to learn how to grind them out in end games. Like as a Nimzo player, it's going to be a valuable skill, and you can practice. One of my favorite things, practice with an engine or practice with a
Yeah,
friend. Sometimes it's easier to just fire up your engine. Play the opponent's side. Play white with the engine in that type position and just watch how quickly the engine's going to pick you apart. And then you can start to use those ideas when you play the black side.
I think in the entire course, I'm recommending, and this is one of them, 3 sort of forced endgame lines. And black has the better part of the endgame in all 3,
Cool.
which is really nice. So you're going to get a lot of practice playing these queenless endgames where almost everything else is still on, but black is scoring really, really well in them. So that should give you a lot of confidence.
So now let's circle back to this move number 9. We just looked at bishop takes f6, kind of that endgame line. Let's look at pawn to f3, the idea being it covers the e4 square. So we don't have
Exactly.
knight e4, but what are we going to do?
Well,
Surprise.
we actually do have a pretty amazing move here. And so this is a good one to remember.
Yeah.
If you can't remember it, black can still equalize with other natural moves like I think b6 or d5 both lead to equality. But we have an amazing move here, and it's knight f to e4.
And let me mention the other top moves even do still give black a small advantage. But this one gives black
Yeah,
a
yeah.
clear
I thought they were
advantage.
only equality, but yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's pretty
Wow.
cool.
Knight e4. So we still play it, and it seems like the only way to try to take advantage of this would be bishop takes queen. We're going to take their queen. Uh, this looks natural, right? What if they fork? Now, there's
Well, it
one,
just has to be the best move.
yeah,
Yeah,
one critical move here that you have to find from the black side. And you can figure this out over the board too. Just kind of count things
I think
out.
very easily. Yeah.
But you have to find knight to b3. So you want to save your knight and attack that rook simultaneously. Okay, so what happens here when the dust settles?
Well, where's the rook going? It has no squares, and so you're going to get a very natural series of trades. We can just recapture after they take our rook because again, this. Yep, sorry,
Yeah, we cover everything with
this rook
those
has no
knights.
squares. We are going to get the rook back. Um, these are all sort of like top moves, so they should give up the rook in this way is the most precise for them. And now we just have b6, and we're going to play bishop a6 and target this pawn, and then bring the other rook. Oh, sorry, not the best arrows. This knight actually blockades any easy defense of this pawn, and we're just going to start ganging up on the c pawn. And materials even. We've got a big lead in development. Our king is already sort of coming towards the middle, which is good for end games, and white still needs to finish developing all these pieces. So just a very, very comfortable ending. Again, we get a lot of these sort of endings in the Nimzo, and I believe Stockfish gives a 1.5 pawn advantage to black already.
And I was peeking down the stockfish lines just now. I think that C pawn drops pretty much by force. Like there's a very quick sequence where we can go.
Oh, why don't you show us?
I think we can go bishop a6. Okay, let's give white a move first. Pawn e3, trying to guard. We have bishop
Yeah.
a6. King moves knight a5. So creating a double
Mm,
attack. And not only do we have a third attacker coming, we also have a fourth attacker
D5, yeah.
with the
And the
pin on
bishop's
the.
undefended.
Yeah, so I
Yeah.
think you're winning that pawn cleanly in this endgame, which is really cool.
It's also nice of them to put their king on the c file where our rook is going. So
Yeah,
that
that's
works
true
out.
too. Yeah, that's true. You're trying to guard with the king and it backfired.
And
All right.
I think it's good to sort of like highlight like this is a course for black. We're not necessarily, and you will see there's other like, and this is white's most solid option. So we're not expecting to just blow white off the board in these lines. When white gets out of line, when white plays unprincipled chess, as they will do in some other chapters, you will see black really takes them to task, and we get some really crushing advantages for black. But these are this chapter is white playing all of the natural moves, all of the principled moves, and a lot of computer moves, and black is consistently equal or better.
And it's like you're going to get to know these pawn structures very well, like we've talked about.
Yeah,
I think it's, even though it's equal, don't think equal means draw. Like equal does not
it's not equal.
necessarily
It's not
mean,
equal dry.
yeah.
No, no, yeah.
And even when it is equal
There's lots of knights
draw-ish,
imbalances.
right? Yeah, you still have imbalances to play with. That's exactly what I was going to say. Okay, so now let's go to 5, knight f3. It's the last move 5. So we got 3 lines left that we're going to look at. And here
Yeah.
we're starting with not a pawn to the 5th rank, but we're going with this flexibility, pawn to d6. And this is kind of your small center strategy, right?
Mm-hmm. This is quite nice. We're staying flexible. We may still, depending on how white proceeds, we might go with the b6 plan. We might go with the fast c5. Fast e5 is playable, or even f5 going into a Dutch structure is. These are all possible. So it's just a very flexible move, and it immediately also prevents knight e5. So that's the idea.
Would you say usually, like, once we have these 2 pawns established, you should kind of start to think dark square strategy, just because you probably don't want to move the d pawn a second time?
Yeah, generally speaking, especially if I'm going to be giving up my dark square bishop, then I'm really focused on dark square strategy.
Mhm.
But not, yeah, we're not necessarily always going pawn e5, pawn c5. Very often you're going to use this as a stepping stone to that Sicilian type structure where we go c5 and c takes d4. And it's nice to have both available. We're not committed just yet, but I'd say that's the path where you generally go down, is either c5 and c takes on d4, or you go for that e5, d6, c5 pawn wedge.
Okay, and then I have a pure student question. So that other structure you talked about with the pawn going to f5, I envision it looking like this with the pawn
That's right.
on b6. Is that correct?
Yeah, classical Dutch.
Yeah, okay. Classical Dutch, or almost like a Nimzo Larson in reverse, like, white playing 1b3, you can get that similar
Yeah,
structure.
yeah.
Okay, cool.
That's very common as well, very possible, and it's certainly one way you can continue.
So from here, should we look at, we got a couple moves for white. Let's look at bishop to g5 first. Most challenging move. And the idea is white just wants to blow open the center again.
Again, it's the same idea over and over and again. So,
Yeah.
um, even if you're not great at learning reams of theory, the takeaway from this chapter, Matt, and this goes through the entirety of the Nimzo, white would like to play e4 in one move on good terms. And now, if we can stop e4, we do that. Or if we can't stop e4, we don't let them play it under good conditions. So here, it just makes sense for us to play knight bd7. That is because we just don't have a move that in time prevents e4. But we're going to see again, this is a situation where e4 does not come on good terms.
Yeah, e3 is actually stronger than e4 here. And I don't know if your
Quite
opponent,
a bit stronger, yeah.
yeah, I don't know if your opponents will always appreciate it. So let's start with e3 first, and then we'll circle back and look at e4. To me, I think e3 is more natural from the white side, just because I know that bishop wants to be probably on d3, and I also know that he doesn't like pawns stuck sitting on e4 and c4. So I'd
Exactly.
be a little afraid of that. So that's why I like e3 as white.
Yep. So having now brought the knight to d7 to reinforce our first knight, we can play the move h6. And we just want to clarify where this bishop is going. They shouldn't give it up. We won't look at that again. We would just recapture with the knight, and black is just better. So not critical. And now we can just play b6 and put our bishop on the long diagonal, fighting for e4. Now, if white were to continue with e4, tactically we would have g5, unpinning this knight and just winning the pawn. So we're fighting for central control in that way. Yes, white can take on g5. That's like a motif that you see, but it just doesn't work here. The knight's already reinforced. This knight can't enter the attack, and we have a big lead in development. So it's it's just not going to work. Bishop d3, developing the last minor piece. We put our last minor piece on its best square. White should castle. And now a key move, bishop takes c3. So something to be aware of is once white castles, this knight does become unpinned. And if we just play another random move absent-mindedly, white can actually move this knight away, usually to b1 or e2. And then this bishop doesn't have anything it can trade for, and then a3, b4 is a big threat. So a lot of the time, especially when you have this structure, this sort of hedgehoggy Queen's Indian type structure, when and you can still go into the dark square strategy. When they castle, it's best practice just to take, so that bishop can't get stranded.
It's good to know because it's not always natural to think, well, will they retreat a knight if we don't take? But yeah, that's something to be afraid of.
I think that, well, those retreating moves are very hard to see, but it would actually, if we didn't take, be the strongest option for white.
It takes losing a game in one of those lines, and you're like, oh yeah, maybe I should take.
And then you
C3.
never forget. Yeah. So queen takes is the natural recapture. B takes is possible, but we can just play c5 and fix the weakness. And again, we'll have that long-term weakness that we can come back to sometime in the future. So queen takes c3 makes sense. And now g5. And this works really, really well. We're breaking the pin, and we're actually converging with all of our pieces onto the king side. And so now we're actually gaining an initiative and starting to move forward on the king side.
So they could go knight takes here, but again, it is going to favor black. So let's look at bishop to g3. Now we go knight h5, targeting the bishop, but also threatening this nice move onto f5. And I love this pawn structure. Like everything is working together. Yeah, we're threatening f4. So you don't even have to take the bishop right away. What do we? Okay, we have one more move for white here. We're showing d5, and we're going to lock it up.
D5. Yeah, I really wanted to show this idea just because I think it's very natural to want to capture, which is not a good move. And so this comes up more in the Queen's Indian than the Nimzo, because in the Queen's Indian, I guess you always get this. So it makes sense that it comes up more there. But d5, you actually almost always want to meet with e5. And the reason for that is our long-term goal is actually f5 and f4 with a massive attack. And we can rehabilitate this bishop by bringing it to c8, where it lines up really nicely as a kingside attacker. So the closing of the center isn't a problem for this bishop at all. And what white has actually allowed us to do is to really solidly grip the middle of the board. And with the middle of the board closed and our control of the middle of the board, we can launch that kingside attack.
And can I show a couple moves just for the
please
negative reinforcement? If you were to take, looks like, hey, you're winning a pawn, and you're not wrong. But white's going to play knight to d4. And this kingside position is wide open. You got a queen pointing on this diagonal, a bishop on this diagonal, and a knight just waiting to head to f5. So put this picture in your mind if it really feels tempting still to take on d5. Yeah, think of this. You do not want that position at all.
Yeah, it didn't even cross my mind to take because I've played these positions so many times.
Yeah.
And if I can offer some positive reinforcement,
thank you.
Checkmate is better than the pawn.
Yes. Kingside attacks and checkmate are always better than one pawn.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to, well, let's look at e4. So when we looked at e3 back here.
So move 74. Yep.
Yeah, 7e4, going aggressive, and we're going to meet him with the Sicilian style. Or wait, I'm sorry, we're meeting him with e5s. I read it wrong.
Yeah, so yeah, this time we can meet them with e5, and this is another like a very common reply. C5 would not stop them pushing e5, so we need to play e5. And there's some really nice ideas here. Absolutely most common is for them to take. and we're going to take back. And this is actually that exchange structure that we talked about earlier, Matt, where
Yeah.
our long-term plan is to play c6, have really, really nice central control. And what else have I said here? So they've DE5, and I think that's the end of the line because we've sort of seen this before. We don't have any weaknesses. We have very comfortable, simple developing moves. Um, black's probably doing black's a little bit better already, just visually. I would imagine that small advantage for black in this situation, and this light square bishop is not going to have a very enjoyable life.
And this is a really good position for the students to play around with a bit too. Like look for model
Yeah,
games or just play through with the engine to really appreciate why these C pawns make such a difference. Because yeah, it's like a 0.3 or 0.4 edge for black. And I think as a student, it's really good for you to know that, not just for the Nimzo-Indian, but a lot of chess
just
openings in
general
general.
chess
Yeah,
development.
that pawn
Yeah,
structure. Yeah, I think we only have one line left. So we had moved 6 bishop g5. So now we're going to go to move 6 pawn to e4. So not pinning the knight, going with the immediate e4. And in my opinion, it feels like we need a pawn break to fight against these pawns. Is that right?
again and again and again. And so we've had a couple conversations now, Matt, about how do you know whether it's c5 or e5?
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is if I play c5, is e5 a big threat? And
I
here
like
it
that.
is. So I know c5 isn't going to work. So what's the move, Matt?
Yep. So I think we got to go with e5. That's a really good point because even on the last one, I got a bit
Yeah,
confused.
yeah. That's just a really good so strategically c5 is more desirable because we get that c pawn trade towards the center, but you have to always be very concrete in the position. And in this position, e5 was a big threat, so we radically prevent e5 by occupying the square ourselves. They can take. We get this exchange structure again, and now we like to include those club mistakes.
Yes.
I've had this twice in OTB, like rapid.
Nice.
Um, this is real bad. This is I think this is one that the viewers will get a lot of quick wins out of. You just can't be so greedy with your king still in the middle. And I notice just looking at the board, Matt, the king and the knight are lined up, and behind the knight is a pawn that's actually loose if we can apply pressure. So is there a really crushing move for black that would somehow take advantage of everything being lined up on the one file?
Slight temptation to queen d4, but much stronger looking to me looks to be rook e8. Bring in the new attacker. I don't even know how white deals with this. Maybe on to f4? But
I
then
think
we
f4 is like the only move to not just lose on the spot. Retreating the knight just gets, I'm pretty sure, it either like leads to catastrophic material loss or checkmate. Um,
yeah, it looks pretty bad because that pawn's dropping in 2 seconds.
and then you've got a discovered attack on the king. So yeah.
Yeah.
So f4 I think is the only reasonable move. And now we just remove the knight.
Yeah, that's so simple. Okay, so if they take, we have this in between move, highlighting this being pinned, this being defended. I mean, that's really good looking for black. If they
Yeah.
don't take, we're going to take on e5 twice, and white's still stuck with these very ugly pawns on the same color
And
as the
and
bishop.
and so white was up a pawn. We're regaining our pawn with a massive attack as well. So um, common theme, you've heard it many times. That lead in development, really, really powerful in the Nimzo, and very often what looks like a very calm, balanced, maneuvering type position. If white makes one misstep, we're all over them.
This was a fun chapter. I think it's critical knowing the 4 queen c2 stuff, and this was our biggest chapter in the course.
Yeah,
But we haven't had really any. Well, he hasn't posed us any big problems in the whole chapter. I'm kind of surprised. Usually from the black side of openings, like you got to be
there's one or
afraid of.
two lines that are challenging.
Yeah,
Yeah.
awesome. All right, so that concludes the Nimzo 4 queen c2 chapter. Any other last thoughts, James, or should we end it there?
I just highlight that playing through these lines, definitely look up some example games. This is it's called the classical variation for a reason. It contains within it all the big themes and ideas of the Nimzo-Indian. And if you understand four queen c2 well, it will position you really, really well to understand, well, why does white play all these other moves on move four? And it's because if white just plays completely naturally, they're not getting anywhere. And so all of white's alternatives are slightly more artificial, trying desperately to find an advantage.
I like that. All right, guys, we will see you in chapter number 2. Bye.